When I think about the Middle Ages, I picture a time when almost everyone in Europe lived out in the countryside. Life followed the natural rhythm of the world around them. People planned their days by watching the sun rise and set, paying attention to the changing seasons, the ebb and flow of the tides, and even the movement of the moon and stars overhead. The clergy and the monks lived very differently. Their daily routine followed a strict schedule that revolved around a carefully developed liturgical calendar, with specific holy days and prayers set for particular times throughout each day. To stay on schedule, they relied on whatever timekeeping tools were available, including sundials, water clocks, astrolabes, and, later on, mechanical clocks. Even with all of those ways to keep track of time, something surprising was still true. During the Middle Ages, figuring out exactly what day it was could be incredibly difficult. So, why was that the case? Why did people celebrate the beginning of the new year on 3 different dates? And why didn't the idea of minutes even exist? One of the best examples I've found of just how confusing dates could be during the Middle Ages comes from the Chronicles of Richard of Devizes, which describes the actions of Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart, King of England. The Chronicle says, "The King of France with his army departed for Jerusalem before the King of England put to sea on the 3rd of the calends of April. The King of England, preparing to leave Sicily, ordered the fort he had built to be dismantled and loaded every piece of its material onto his ships. He had already stocked his fleet with every kind of siege engine and every weapon that the mind of man could devise. Robert, the son of William Fitz-Ralph, was consecrated Bishop of Worcester by William de Longchamp, the papal legate at Canterbury, on the 3rd of the nones of May." At first glance, that wording is enough to make anyone stop and wonder what they're reading. What exactly do phrases like the 3rd of the calends of April or the 3rd of the nones of May even mean? To understand that, I have to remember that during the Middle Ages, at least in Western Europe, the way people measured dates and organized their calendars was heavily influenced by the Catholic Church. Many of those traditions were also leftovers from the Roman Empire, which continued shaping everyday life long after Rome itself had fallen. According to Ian Mortimer in The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England, medieval people didn't even consider January 1st to be the first day of the new year. Noble families might exchange gifts on that date, but that didn't make it New Year's Day in the official sense. Instead, most people in medieval England believed the Year of Grace, or the Year of Our Lord, began on Lady Day, which fell on March 25th. Lady Day, also known as the Feast of the Annunciation, marked the day when the Archangel Gabriel appeared to the Virgin Mary, according to the New Testament, and told her that she would become the mother of Jesus. From 1155 until 1752, when Great Britain and its empire adopted the Gregorian calendar, Lady Day officially marked the beginning of the calendar year in England. That wasn't the end of the story, though. The English Exchequer, which handled the kingdom's finances, didn't use Lady Day as the start of its fiscal year. Instead, it began on Michaelmas, celebrated on September 29th in the Western Christian calendar and on November 8th in the Eastern tradition. Michaelmas honored Saint Michael and all of the angels. By this point, things were already complicated enough. There were effectively 3 different dates associated with the beginning of a new year, depending on whether you were talking about religious, civil, or financial matters. But the confusion didn't stop there, because every country followed its own dating system. For example, what we would now call January 1st, 1367, in England wasn't necessarily the same year somewhere else. In Venice and Florence, that exact day was still considered part of 1366. In Pisa, however, it was already 1367, because their year had begun on the previous March 25th. Ian Mortimer explains the confusion with a memorable example. If I sailed from England on January 1st, 1366, and arrived in Pisa in the middle of February, I would suddenly find myself living in 1367. If I continued on to Venice before the end of February, I'd be back in 1366 again. Leaving Venice after March 1st would put me in 1367 once more. Then, if I rode over to Florence, I'd return to 1366. Finally, if I made my way back to Pisa on or after March 25th, the calendar there would now say it was 1368. As if that weren't confusing enough, traveling farther west only made things stranger. If I sailed to Portugal or Castile, the date would be calculated using the old Spanish era, a system that counted years beginning in 38 BC instead of the birth of Christ. Under that calendar, the year would be 1405. Portugal continued using that system until 1422, while Castile kept it until 1384. Just when I think medieval dating can't get any more complicated, I discover there's another layer to it. A lot of people in England didn't usually count the years using the Anno Domini, or Year of Our Lord, system based on the birth of Christ. Instead, they relied on something called the regnal year, which measured time according to how long the current king had been on the throne. Under that system, an event might be recorded as happening in the 1st, 10th, or 17th year of a monarch's reign. That also meant a new year didn't necessarily begin on January 1st or even Lady Day. As far as the regnal calendar was concerned, the year restarted on the exact day the king took the throne. Take the year 1388 as an example. Most people in England considered the year to begin on March the 25th, but they would also describe it as the 11th year of King Richard II, because Richard had become king on June 22nd, 1377. That creates an interesting problem. The year itself was often counted according to the king's reign, while the individual days within that year were usually identified by the church's calendar, which was heavily influenced by religious feast days and the ever-changing date of Easter. Because of that, what we would simply call March 23rd, 1388, could instead be written as the Monday before the feast of the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, in the 11th year of the reign of King Richard II after the conquest. Are you still following all of this? It's definitely not the shortest or clearest way to write a date. It's no wonder people occasionally mix things up. Even confusing the Feast of the Annunciation with the Feast of the Assumption could point to an entirely different day, or even a completely different year. When priests wrote formal documents in Latin, they usually referred to dates as being in the Year of Grace, or the Year of Our Lord. Chroniclers, however, often preferred using the regnal year instead. William of Malmesbury is a good example. He spent his entire adult life as a monk at Malmesbury Abbey and completed the deeds of the English kings in 1125. Throughout his work, he regularly dated events using the Year of Our Lord. At one point, he wrote, "This was the year of our Lord, 495, being the 8th year after Hengist's death." Later, while describing the death of King William II, he recorded that the king died in the year of our Lord 1100 and the 13th year of his reign, on the 2nd of August. I think it's safe to assume William of Malmesbury wasn't several hundred years old. He was simply describing events from many different periods while consistently using the same dating system. Not every source handled dates that way, though. The 14th century calendar rolls of the City of London preferred the regnal system. One entry explains that in the final year of King Edward III's reign, and again during the first year of his successor's rule, the citizens complained that the coroner wasn't under the authority of the city government. They petitioned the king for permission to elect their own coroner and remove him whenever necessary. The chronicler, Richard of Devizes, took things in yet another direction. While writing about the Third Crusade, he identified the year by listing the major rulers of the time. He described it as the year of the Incarnate Word, 1187. When Urban III was pope, Frederick ruled as Emperor of Germany, Isaac reigned in Constantinople, Philip ruled France, Henry ruled England, and William ruled Sicily. I guess if there were ever any doubt about which year he meant, that list certainly narrowed it down. Throughout the Middle Ages, people followed the Roman Julian calendar, which Julius Caesar introduced in 46 BC. That system remained in use until Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1582. The Julian calendar organized each month around three important reference points. The kalends marked the first day of the month, the nones came several days later, and the ides fell around the middle of the month. These dates were tied to the phases of the moon, with the ides traditionally associated with the full moon. Instead of counting days forward the way I do today, medieval people usually counted backward from one of those major reference dates. To figure out a date correctly, you first had to know exactly how many days were in the month. And just to make things even more confusing, a date described as being before the calends of April actually fell in March, not April. Now I can finally make sense of the example involving Richard the Lionheart. When the Chronicle says the King of France sailed on the third day before the calends of April, it means I count backward from April 1st. The second day before the calends is March 31st, and the third is March 30th. That's the actual date he put to sea. The same idea explains the third of the nones of May. Since the nones fall on May 7th, counting backward places the second day on May 6th and the third on May 5th. That's the day Robert was consecrated as bishop. See? Once I understand how the system works, it actually starts to make sense. I guess we've both learned something new. Not every date was written using calendar markers either. Sometimes people identified a day by referring to a religious feast or holiday instead. A document might mention something like the 18th day after Trinity, or Septuagesima Sunday. Septuagesima was the 9th Sunday before Easter and marked the beginning of the Church's preparations for the season of Lent. When I started looking into how people measured time during the Middle Ages, I found something that really surprised me. Before mechanical clocks had minute hands, the idea of a minute as a regular unit of time didn't really exist for most people. For centuries, clocks only displayed the hour. It wasn't until the late 17th century that minute hands became common. Some water clocks were accurate enough to measure time in roughly 15-minute intervals, but sundials and candle clocks simply couldn't offer that level of precision. Another thing that's easy to forget is that medieval people didn't count the hours of the day from midnight the way I do today. Instead, the day began at sunrise. Because sunrise changed with the seasons and varied depending on where someone lived, the length of an hour changed too. Throughout most of the Middle Ages, the time between sunrise and sunset was divided into 12 equal hours. The period from sunset until the following sunrise was also split into another 12 hours. Since daylight was longer in the summer and shorter in the winter, the hours stretched and shrank along with it. That meant people living in different parts of Europe experienced very different hour lengths. In northern places like Norway, where Christmas brought only about 6 hours of daylight, each daytime hour lasted only around 30 minutes by today's measurements. Farther south, in a city like Naples, there were more than 9 hours of daylight at the same time of year, so each daytime hour lasted close to 50 modern minutes. Monks followed an even more structured daily routine. They divided every 24-hour day into 8 liturgical offices: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Bells announced each period of prayer and guided the rhythm of monastic life. At dawn, the bell for prime was rung. Terce came during the middle of the morning, marking the 3rd hour of the day. Sext was observed at the 6th hour around midday, while none took place during the 9th hour in the middle of the afternoon. Compline followed at the 12th hour, shortly after sunset. Because the hours shifted with the seasons, the bells did too. In London, during the middle of winter, the prime bell rang at about 8 o'clock in the morning. During the height of summer, however, that same bell could ring as early as 3:40 a.m. Compline usually fell sometime between 5 and 6 o'clock on a winter evening, but in the summer it wasn't heard until around 9:30 p.m. The first clock known to strike the hours was recorded in Milan in 1336. Before long, that technology spread across Europe. Similar clocks appeared in the palaces of King Edward III of England, and by the late 14th century they could also be found in several cathedrals. Interestingly, those early mechanical clocks didn't even have hour hands. Instead, they simply rang a bell whenever another hour had passed, letting everyone nearby know the time by sound rather than by looking at a clock face. As mechanical clocks became more common, people gradually stopped relying on daylight to define the length of an hour. Eventually, every hour became the same length throughout the entire year, no matter the season. Even then, many medieval people continued using older methods of telling time for quite a while. But little by little, clock time became the standard. People began referring to the hour announced by the clock as "of the clock," a phrase that eventually shortened to "o'clock," a familiar expression that's still part of everyday English today. When I think about everyday life in the Middle Ages, one thing really stands out. Unless someone belonged to the aristocracy, and most people certainly didn't, there was very little chance that their exact birthday was ever written down. Most ordinary people were farmers who worked the land, and they measured the passing of time by the changing seasons rather than by specific dates on a calendar. As children grew up, their parents might simply tell them they had been born during the summer, around Christmas, or at harvest time. The Catholic Church celebrated an enormous number of feast days throughout the year, so it was also common for someone to remember a birth by linking it to one of those occasions. Instead of recording an exact date, people might say a child was born on the day before or the day after a particular religious festival. When it came to the year itself, most people probably kept track of time by remembering who their king was and how long he had been reigning. Because of that, the regnal year was likely the system they used most often. I can easily imagine a mother telling her daughter something like this. "You were born in the summer during the 5th year of King Henry VI's reign. Now we're in the 17th year, so that means you're about 12 years old." For most medieval people, having an exact age probably wasn't very important. An estimate was usually good enough. What mattered far more was knowing whether someone was old enough to start working, begin an apprenticeship, get married, or raise a family. Those milestones carried much more significance than celebrating a precise birthday. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of Medieval Madness. If you enjoyed hearing about the strange and surprisingly complicated ways people measured time during the Middle Ages, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. We upload new videos on the 6th day named by our ancestors, the day that follows the hard work of Thursday and signals that the week's burdens are almost over. In other words, every Friday. Thanks again for watching. I hope you have a fantastic week, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.